Hello, good evening. It's incredibly cold upstairs in our house, which is why I'm dressed extremely warmly, feeling a bit like a Russian countess in this fantastic garment, along with such a great warm, cozy scarf. um, and I was thinking about how to stay warm in the cold. And one of the best ways, I think, to stay warm on a chilly night is to read aloud with a partner or someone that you live with or a handy child. But reading aloud is definitely not just for parents reading to children. It's for adults reading to each other. It's for friends. It's for people who are just meeting, it's for couples, it's for romantic flirtations, and it's for groups of friends as well. Reading aloud is something that I talk about a lot in my bibliotherapy sessions, and I'm always trying to persuade people to read aloud with whoever they live with, whether it's a partner, a relative, an elderly parent, anyone that comes to hand on a winter's night should be collared and read aloud to, because it's a lost art of wonderful sociability where you can be with someone reading aloud, but you don't actually have to talk to them if you think about it. So it's quite relaxing when you read aloud. You're entertaining the other person with your reading, but you're also entertaining yourself, and you're not literally having a conversation. You, when you read aloud, you create a bubble that the two of you are in when you're reading aloud. You create this fictional universe together, which is just the two of you plus the author. And it's a magical moment where you two, the readers, or there might be more of you, are building a fictional universe which only the two of you will be in at that moment, but you're connected with all the other people that have read that book or that story in its entire existence. It's an incredibly magical thing. Your finger is on the pulse of the reading universe when you read aloud, because you're giving voice to a story which a writer has written and sharing that with one other person. It's incredibly intimate because it's just your voices and your being together at that moment. The reader is giving of themselves to the listener, and the listener is giving their attention to the reader. So it's a very generous thing to do as well when you read aloud. There's an amazing generosity to the act of reading aloud. And I'm brandishing this book, which is a kind of bit of an academic tome, The Social Life of Books by Abigail Williams, which is all about the way that books used to be read aloud and how books used to be much more of a sociable activity. For instance, in the days of uh, Charles Dickens's books were read aloud every week because his books were published in the newspaper on a weekly basis, and whoever got the newspaper and could read would read the latest instalment, for instance, of the Pickwick Papers, to everyone else sitting around them. And that was like a kind of soap opera where everyone got together and shared the latest instalment of the famous book, and people were literally clamoring on the streets to hear that next installment. Apparently, it was published over in the States as well as when it was published in England, but the newspapers had to be physically taken to the States from England, and people would be clamoring at the dock when the boats arrived from England with the latest Charles Dickens installment to be read aloud to the people in the States. And they would be shouting to the people in the boat, what happened? What happened to Little Nell, for instance, when Little Nell was being published back in the day of Charles Dickens? So We're talking about why reading aloud is a fabulous thing to do this evening. And I've got a few examples of books that are great to read aloud. So I've got quite a lot and I'm not quite sure where to start. But one of my faves is this fantastic collection, Overheard Stories to Read Aloud, which is edited by Jonathan Taylor. And is that the one I was thinking it was? Oh, yeah, there's another one which is quite similar, which I'll be coming to as well. There's quite a few collections of reading aloud stories. There's Overheard Stories to Read Aloud, and then there's also To Read Aloud by Francesco Dimitri, which is another fantastic collection of stories to read aloud. So I'm going to talk about both of these. And many more brilliant collections, which I would urge you to get and share with people. So this one, Overheard by Jonathan, edited by Jonathan Taylor, is a really interesting collection because it's got different types of stories based on, in a way, the level of emotion that you put into each story. So the first section is whispering stories, which are kind of quiet stories about maybe the edge of death and maybe kind of ghostly type stories. Then we've got telling stories, which are stories which are kind of more plot driven. Crying stories, stories which are obviously going to be depressing. Laughing stories, self-explanatory. Shouting stories. The first one is a Hanif Qureshi story, Weddings and Beheadings. And then there's quite a lot of other fantastic writers in here. For instance, Lee Rourke, Robert Shearman, Hanif Qureshi I mentioned already, Will Buckingham, Katie Darby, all sorts of brilliant writers. And then there's also singing stories, which are in theory more kind of spiritual and harmonious kinds of stories. So this is a really interesting book to take with you, perhaps when you go on a drive, a long drive, where you need to entertain your driving companion, and you can read uh, any of the from any of the sections within the book. So you might think you want a shouting story, you might think you want a sad story, you might want a crying story or a whispering story. Probably not ideal for the car. And this book is a really fantastic collection of stories to read aloud. The other nice thing about it is that the stories are all quite short and obviously chosen to be readable in a short space of time. So each one is only kind of 4 to 5 pages long, which is also very helpful. Because I think when people first start reading aloud, if you haven't done it before, then you probably don't want to have books, stories that are too long. This one, To Read Aloud, which is subtitled A Literary Toolkit for Well-Being by Francesco Dimitri, is another really fantastic collection of short stories collated in order to be read aloud. And I'm going to read you his introduction to this book because it actually puts it very well why reading aloud is such a great thing. But I'll just tell you his sections within his book. He's got love, loss, change, pleasure, work, nature, chaos, lightness, wonder, and coda, delicacies for discussion. So I'll read you his intro because I think that explains better than me why reading aloud is so fabulous and important. And he puts into words what I've been trying to urge people to do for most of my bibliotherapeutic career. Around a campfire and over mammoth steaks, our prehistoric ancestors we're already telling tall tales. That was the biggest mammoth that ever was. It wasn't even a mammoth, I'm telling you, it was a monster. It cried with a human voice. By sharing stories, they gathered. By gathering, they became stronger. Sharing stories is what makes humans human. More than the fire, it was the campfire that allowed Homo sapiens to come together and create tribes, cities, and states. Campfires, you see, that's what it's all about. We all need to sit around the campfire and tell tales and read them aloud. When we use the word story today, we think of writing on a page or images on a screen. A story is an object, a thing. And yet, for most of human history, the only way you could experience a story was to hear it from the lips of a storyteller. A story was not a thing, but an event that people could be drawn to. They would meet, listen, laugh, and perhaps fight and then make up. The story was the campfire was the story. Many kinds of fires have been lit throughout the millennia. We say that a person called Homer wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, but we don't actually know if he was the one who wrote them down, or even if he existed at all. What we do know is that in the ancient Greek city-states, there were epic poets who told extraordinary tales to people as they feasted. Tales of kings and princes and the duels they fought, of wooden horses used as subterfuges in war, of beautiful creatures, part woman, part bird, who lured unsuspecting mariners to their deaths. Their words weren't meant to be written down and read, but spoken and heard. So for people just joining, this is Francesco Dimitri's literary toolkit for well-being, and what a fabulous collection it is. It was not only stories that were told aloud, but also items of news, pieces of wisdom, everything that now belongs to ink and paper and screen. In Greece and Rome, skilled orators would attract crowds. Socrates would make philosophy by talking to people in the streets. Folk tales were repeated at harvest bonfires. Strange news travelled from mouth to mouth and market to market. Ghost stories were whispered on long winter nights. There is something powerful in being there in person while words happen. It creates a bond, a sense of community. It generates conversations about matters more interesting than the weather. Listening to words read aloud is, quite simply, a lovely experience. So why don't we do it anymore? It's not that we don't share art. We do every day. Part of the pleasure of going to the cinema comes from your being there with other people, crossing your fingers. They won't be of the keeping their phone on persuasion. That's just unforgivable. Television can be shared also. You might not have watched How I Met Your Mother if your partner had not asked you to, just as your partner only watched Breaking Bad because you were doing so. Together you crack jokes, gorge on popcorn. Sure, many of us also watch films and TV series on our own, but it is just as common, indeed, probably more so, to watch them in company. The same goes for most forms of art. Actually, that is a point that's just occurring to me. I always feel quite evil to watch TV on my own. It seems wrong. Whereas obviously reading a book tends to be something that you do on your own. Catherine, great to see you. I wonder if you've ever discovered this book and whether you do occasionally read aloud. I'd love to know if anyone listening tonight does read aloud. And if you do you have particular books that you love to read aloud? Come back to this one in a minute. One of the books that I most frequently recommend for reading aloud, just trying to find it, is Some by David Eagleman, S-U-M, here it is, which is 40 Tales from the Afterlives, which is a really lovely collection of 40 stories, all incredibly short, which only can be read in like 5 to 10 minutes. Each story is sometimes only one page, sometimes two or three, and they're all very playful ideas about the afterlife. And the effect they have is to make you appreciate life itself far more once you finish the end of the story. So they're very life affirming. I often recommend this to people and they think it looks a bit depressing. It's got a kind of deathly cover, but they're actually incredibly positive and uplifting tales because they talk about ideas like if what happens when you die, do you go to a place where you have to relive your entire life moment by moment? So for instance, where all the moments are put together, so you spend 2 years sitting on the loo, 3 years waiting in a bus queue, 12 years sleeping in your bed, 5 years trying to make a date, and so on. And I think there's only something like 8 minutes of pure, unadulterated joy in his version of what your life might be if it was made into little chunks. So he describes such an afterlife where you have to relive all your life like that. And by the end of reading that, you feel like, thank God I don't have to live like that. I can actually live in a wonderful jumble of moments, which are occasionally fabulous and occasionally terrible. But at least I get to have a day that's full of ups and downs rather than all happening in one go. So, this is one of the books that I recommend very regularly to read aloud with a partner or friend. But this is also an absolutely fabulous reading aloud book, which is collated by Francesco Dimitri, who's a member of the faculty of the School of Life. Intriguingly, or he was when this was written. I don't know if that faculty is still going on nowadays. I'll just read you a little bit more from his introduction because I think he puts it so well about why reading aloud is fabulous. We don't share words anymore, though. Words belong to books, and you're supposed to relish a book all on your own. Let me be clear, that sense of taking a solitary walk in the woods, as Umberto Eco put it, is a wonderful special thing books do, an authentic form of magic. But books can work a different magic as well. Books can be for sharing. Fast forward from bardic halls to a living room in present day London, and you will see me taking coffee with my wife, a friend of ours, and her 2-year-old daughter. Our friend was visiting for an early winter weekend, armed with the tools of a young mother's trade, toys and puppets and miniature drums, and a book about a witch. Hang on, suddenly lost the next bit. My friend knows that I have some odd interests, the history of magic being one. So during a second round of coffee, she picked up the book and started reading it to me. It was meant to be a joke, but I found myself engrossed. Groggy and sleep deprived as I was, we'd had a late night, I was drawn into the world of a witch on a broomstick who flew over the country having adventures that weren't exactly thought provoking, but were strangely fascinating to me. I glanced at my wife and the little girl. The spell was working on them as well. So we all sat, 2 adults and 1 child, listening to the story. My friend, somewhat bemused, was kind enough to read it out to the very end. The story obliterated the last traces of doziness in a way that caffeine hadn't managed to do, and the witch remained stuck in my head. Why had my wife and I enjoyed that reading so much? Neither of us would have read the story on our own, and yet both of us had been delighted by it. There was something mysterious at work there. But what was it? A few days later, I was clearing the last autumn leaves from the garden when my eyes fell on the small, rusty fire pit we have in a corner. The penny dropped, and I understood. We had built a campfire. The idea of reading aloud to grown-ups is not new, as I keep telling you. In the past, people would read aloud for a variety of reasons: to woo their beloved, which is a great way to fall in love with someone, happened to me, to inspire a friend, to persuade someone in their care to take a particular course of action. The novelist Flaubert read aloud everything he wrote to check the quality of his writing. It was not only stories that were read aloud, but also reflections, meditations, pieces of practical philosophy. Reading aloud and listening used to be a widely enjoyed leisure activity and a way of giving and receiving advice. The time has come to rediscover it. I completely agree with good old Francesco Dimitri. And he has put together a really great collection of short stories to read aloud, which has sections like love, as I was telling you earlier, with some classic stories like the story of Balkis and Philemon. Um, then there's some Tolkien in there. There's all kinds of famous and brilliant authors. Some you'll know, some you won't. Just trying to find the list of authors to share with you. So we've got Daphne du Maurier, Graham Joyce, The Limits of Enchantment. There's a section of Rebecca. There are sections of books as well, which is also one of the reasons that I love this book. There are sections on change with Zora Neale Hurston, Rebecca Solnit, A Field Guide to Getting Lost. That's a really fantastic book. And here we just have a little section of it. Laughing John, great to see you this evening. There's a section on pleasure, and Francesco Dimitri himself writes a little short story at the beginning of each of these sections. So in this one, in pleasure, he's written a bit about Psyche and Eros, which is a really interesting story. Joanne Harris has a section from Chocolat. Anais Nin has Manuel, that's an erotic story. There's Epicurus in there. D.H. Lawrence, bit of Lady Chatterley's lover. There's Giacomo Leopardi, dialogue of Torquato Tasso and his familiar genius from the operetta Morali. Then there's a section on work. We've got George Orwell, Anthony Trollope, Elizabeth Gaskell. Then there's nature, Robert Macfarlane, Isabella Bird, Chris Yates, Amy Leach. It's possibly the best collection I've ever seen of short stories. Chaos. But then the other thing is they're not just short stories, they're extracts, which is also why I love it. So we got a bit from David Mitchell's Black Swan Green, Alice Hoffman's Practical Magic, Catherine Mansfield's Bank Holiday. Then we've also got Wonder, and we've got Kenneth Graham, The Wind in the Willows. Another marvellous little section there. So this is a really great collection, which I would recommend to any person embarking on the joys of reading aloud. So there's also some fantastic collections of short stories, which are the Everyman collection of short stories. They've done quite a few different books with collected short stories. So this one's The Christmas Stories, which is a really good collection. Thoroughly recommend that. Then we've got London Stories, Stories of Motherhood, Paris Stories. And I think there's about 20 in this collection. They're really lovely physical books. They're a really nice size, quite easy to transport, take away with you to a little Airbnb with a log fire. And just lovely collections, really well collated. So I'd recommend all of those. Obviously, the Christmas ones would be pretty relevant to now, but all the other ones are great. I think they have cats and dogs collections. They have garden collections. Anything that you have an interest in, they've got a collection of those short stories. So another interesting collection of short stories to try reading aloud is this one, Anthropology by Dan Rhodes, which is really fun because each story is only 101 words long, and they're surreal, they're funny, they're a bit weird, they're quite challenging at times, but they're really good to read aloud. I'm going to read one at random and see what you think. This one is called Paint on page 124. My girlfriend is so besotted that she can't take her eyes off me. After we've turned out the light, she puts on her night vision goggles and watches me as I sleep. Quite often I'm woken by her sighing and her involuntary yelps of happiness. This has been going on for years and is showing no sign of abating. Once I asked her to stop all this infrared activity, but it didn't really work. I'd wake up to find her covering me in luminous paint and softly whispering, "Sometimes I wonder if you know how much I love you." That's a great story, and only 101 words long. I'm going to give you one more. I do love Dan Rhodes. He is a very funny and lovely writer, and a bit strange at times. Pumpkins. Here's another random one. Can't remember what happens in this. I told Sapphire I'd always wanted to grow pumpkins, that my dream was to grow one so big that I could hollow it out and sit in it. Then, if it was watertight, I would climb in and float down the river on Carnival Day, waving to the children on the shore. She broke off from painting her long nails to tell me I'd be lucky to grow a pumpkin big enough for a dog, let alone a person, and that even if I could, there would be no point. I decided she was right. I don't want to grow pumpkins. So that one's not such an uplifting story, but still rather enjoyable. Okay, I'll just do one more because they're quite addictive once you get going. This one's called Travel. Every day I send Lucia a photograph of myself. Sometimes the shot will include a recent newspaper to prove that it's up to date. Just lately, I've started travelling around the world. Sobbing, I'll ask a fellow tourist to photograph me at Golden Gate Bridge, the Acropolis, or the mud palaces of Mali. And in every shot, I'm visibly distraught. She said she was sure I'd get over it in time, but I know I never will. That no matter where I go, all I will ever really see is her lovely guilty face, telling me she'd found somebody new. That one's rather sad as well. So these are all love stories, this collection, Anthropology, by Dan Rhodes. And I would very much recommend that as a fun one to read aloud. You might then feel inspired to write your own story of 101 words only. So that's another one that I love to recommend people for reading aloud. Then I've got a few more that I want to tell you about. Oh, J.D. Salinger for Esme with Love and Squalor, one of my favourite ever books. A great collection of short stories, which are fabulous to read aloud. They're a little bit more challenging in a way than some of the other ones I've been talking about. There's something about the rhythm of the way that he writes that takes you a little bit of getting into for reading aloud, I have found myself. But then the stories are absolutely brilliant. J.D. Salinger, who wrote The Catcher in the Rye, which is what he's most famous for, also wrote several collections of short stories. And for me, this is the best. So in this collection, we have A Perfect Day for Banana Fish, which is an absolutely devastating and brilliant read. Uncle Wiggily in Connecticut, Just Before the War with the Eskimos, The Laughing Man, Down at the Dinghy for Esme with Love and Squalor, Pretty Mouth and Green My Eyes, Dodumia Smith's Blue Period, and Teddy. What I love about this collection and about all of Salinger is that he brings in the same characters into lots of his books. So we have a man called Seymour, who is a really fabulous character who comes into many of the stories. And he always has incredibly precocious children or young people who have a lot to say and they get all the best dialogue. So I won't tell you more because I just think you've got to discover these for yourselves. But they're brilliant short stories and they're great to read aloud. J.D. Salinger. Then another one that's great for reading aloud is Ovid's Metamorphoses. So this is a book that is long, fat, and full of amazing stories. But the joy of the book, which is written in verse translated from the Latin, is that you can open it pretty much at random and find a story which is going to surprise you, provoke recognition, because quite often there are stories in here that you know, like the story of Narcissus and Echo, for instance. That's just come to me as I was flicking through it. The story of Tiresias the prophet, um, the story of the creation of the world with Prometheus giving fire to men for the first time. So there's all sorts of familiar myths in here, which you will know because Ovid based this whole book of Metamorphoses on famous myths that he knew about of his time. He wrote it in AD 46, and he kind of collated all the myths of that time. Suddenly getting really hot now, and saw this energy thinking about Ovid. And he put them all together into beautiful verse. And if you can get hold of a good translation, they're great to read in English as well. And I love them because they are familiar stories. Each story is quite short, so it's normally 4 or 5 pages. You can randomly pick it up and find something fun and interesting. And they're great to share as well. And they're also all about change, all about people changing from one state to another, from a girl into a tree, from a god into a goat, uh, from a man into a flower, and so on. And I find something incredibly reassuring about these stories because you feel like everything in life is in a state of flux, and even death does not seem so permanent and terrible when you're reading Ovid because people change from a state of death into a state of life when they grow new shoots. So that is Ovid's Metamorphoses. Then I think when we're talking about reading aloud, we must mention the joys of ghost stories, which are really fun to read aloud. Because I think when you're reading aloud, it is great, ideally, to have a candle, to sit by a fire, and maybe to have just a little bit of a delicious thrill to what you're reading and the stories that you're hearing. You want maybe something a little bit supernatural sometimes. So this collection, The Haunting Season, Ghostly Tales for Long Winter Nights, is a really lovely collection with lots of great authors like Bridget Collins, Laura Purcell, Elizabeth McNeil, Imogen Hermes Gower, Jess Kidd, Natasha Pulley, Kieran Millwood Hargreave, Andrew Michael Hurley. So they're modern authors writing now who creating new ghost stories. So this was published, I think, in 2021, and then the same publisher and group has created a new one, which is called The Winter Spirits, Ghostly Tales for Frosty Nights, which has many of the same authors, Kieran Millwood Hargreave, um, Elizabeth McNeil, Natasha Pulley, Jess Kidd, Laura Purcell, and they've written new chilling tales, which are really good as well. And they're really fun to read aloud. They're quite chilling. They're quite unsettling. They're lots of them are based on um, ideas of ghostliness that you might have come across before. So there's one that definitely has echoes of Quiet as a Nun with a kind of rocking chair woman in an attic, utterly terrifying. But in a way, it's all the better for being slightly familiar. So I think what sometimes makes a great ghost story to read aloud is its familiarity. The fact that you might have heard something a bit like it before makes it all the more wonderful because you get the images that you might have had when you first heard the story or maybe saw the TV program, as with Quiet as a Nun. And so you've got those images in your head which are reawakened by the story that you're now hearing. So this is a lovely collection. Both of these thoroughly recommended. Winter Spirits was only published in the middle of October this year. Then one that I also love and think is great for reading aloud is Stephen Millhauser. he's written some really fantastic books, several books of short stories, and they're also great for reading aloud. The one that's the title story, Dangerous Laughter, is about a group of teenagers who get into this kind of cult of making each other laugh so hysterically that they almost die of laughter. And it actually becomes quite sinister, but it also really makes you laugh. And there's something really bizarre and uncomfortable about it. And all of his short stories in this collection, anyway, have something a little bit weird, sometimes a little bit supernatural, sometimes a little bit magic realist, a bit like Haruki Murakami kind of vibe. And but they're really fun and great for reading aloud as well. So I had a couple more that I wanted to mention. One of which I don't think I've got to hand, which is Ted Chiang, who I would love you all to read. He's one of the best writers around now, who wrote a book called The Story of Your Life The Story of Your Life and Others. That's a collection of his first collection of short stories, which was published back in 2001, I do believe. And then he also wrote another collection of short stories, which is called Breath. I'm kind of looking behind to see if I can see it on my bookshelf, but I think it's downstairs, so I can't show it to you. But this is Ted Chiang I'm talking about, who wrote The Story of Your Life, which was turned into a film called Arrival, which is an amazing film and a fantastic story. That's how I discovered him, because I saw the film, loved it, heard it was based on the story, read the story, then read the rest of his stories, and they're all quite extraordinary. So The Story of Your Life is all about language and the importance and wonder of language, and it has an alien race bringing a new unifying language to humanity. Then he also wrote a brilliant one that's all about, I can't remember the title of the story, it's about people being given a pill when they're young that stops them from seeing the beauty of others. So it means that people don't judge each other on their physical beauty. They judge each other on whether they really like them as characters, and they base their judgment purely on how well they get on with the other person, nothing to do with their physicality. And then they get the option to stop taking the pill when they're grown up. Of course, then things might start going horribly wrong. So Ted Chiang always has really brilliant ideas, which are quite challenging, quite unusual. Like he has kind of Old Testament angels who are suddenly appearing in the world and basically destroying people with their awesomeness unintentionally, but in a rather fantastic way, and the way that you might imagine an Old Testament angel might really be an absolutely terrifying, massive, and unimaginable being. So, Ted Chiang, he's fab, brilliant writer, great to read to yourself, or even better, get the book and read aloud with a friend or lover or someone that you're just at the beginning of a tentative relationship with, because there's nothing like reading aloud as a way of seducing someone, particularly if you love their voice, which one would hope that you do. So another one which is great to read aloud is good old Italo Calvino, Cosmic Comics. I have indeed read these stories aloud with my husband. We've spent many a year reading aloud together, and we started off reading aloud in a tree outside the house where we lived, in just outside Potter's Bar. Keeper's Cottage was the name of the house, which is sadly now derelict. And it seems like a bit of a ghost story to go back there. I must go back to that tree and see what's happened to it. So, Cosmic Comics is a fantastic collection by Italo Calvino, which is a kind of just so stories for grown ups. So, each of the stories describes a different aspect of life on our planet. So, for instance, the first story is all about when the moon was so close to the Earth that you could put a ladder up to the moon and go up the ladder and collect cheese from the moon and bring it down again. It's a kind of honey like cheese. Uh, then there's another story. So that one's called The Distance of the Moon, and it describes how two lovers decamp to the moon and actually go and live on the moon. They never come back when they go up the ladder. Then there's, I love all the titles of the book, of the stories. At Daybreak, A Sign in Space, All at One Point, Without Colours, Games Without End, The Aquatic Uncle, The Dinosaurs, The Form of Space, The Light Years, The Spiral. And each of these stories describes a different aspect of the world, like colour. How did colour come into the world? And they're very much metaphorical tales, but with really fantastic characters in the stories. So you completely get hooked into the story because of the characters, but they also really make you think about the nature of being and the nature of the world. And that's why they're great to read aloud and share with someone, because they're very thought provoking and you'll have a lot to talk about at the end of the story. Another one that you might think could be a little bit of a depressing read is The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. And it is depressing, let's be honest, because it's all about a woman who has a baby, essentially gets postnatal depression, although it wasn't called that at the time, and goes quietly mad because her husband kind of locks her up in a house, in a room with yellow wallpaper, and she goes round and round the room and possibly eventually disappears behind the yellow wallpaper. It's incredibly sinister, but a great story and a really good one to read aloud. I've also got this collection by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, which has other stories as well as that one. And they're all really good reads because she is a beautiful writer. And they have titles like The Unexpected, and obviously there's The Yellow Wallpaper, A Council of War, Her Beauty. She's a totally feminist and fascinating writer who really gives you a glimpse into life at the time that she was writing, which was in the 1890s and thereabouts. I'll just read you a tiny bit of The Yellow Wallpaper so you get a little bit of a sense of what it's like to read. If you've never read it, you've got to get hold of it. You can get a £1 copy from this Penguin collection. Oh, that doesn't say £1. £2 nowadays. And you should read it to yourself or read it with a friend. I'll just read you a tiny bit. It is very seldom that mere ordinary people like John and myself secure ancestral halls for the summer. Great start, we're in there already. A colonial mansion, a hereditary estate, I would say a haunted house, and reach the height of romantic felicity, but that would be asking too much of fate. Still, I would proudly declare that there is something queer about it. Else, why would it be let so cheaply, and why have stood so long untenanted? John laughs at me, of course, but one expects that in marriage. John is practical in the extreme. He has no patience with faith, an intense horror of superstition, and he scoffs openly at any talk of things not to be felt and seen and put down in figures. John is a physician, and perhaps, I would not say it to a living soul, of course, but this is dead paper and a great relief to my mind. Perhaps that is one reason I do not get well faster. That's already completely gripping and intriguing. Why is she not getting well, despite her husband being a physician? That is an absolutely fantastic read. Get it if it's one thing that you get this Christmas. I would say get that book. And going back to the collections I've been talking about, if there's another great collection that you want for reading aloud, I would go for this, which is a really lovely great collection of stories to read aloud. Finally, an utter classic that is probably the ultimate read aloud book in this season is A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. And I know a lot of people have a tradition of reading aloud this book with their family, which only takes about an hour and a half to read aloud the whole thing at some point over Christmas. And that is a lovely thing to do. It does have all kinds of human life in it. It's funny, it's dark, it's sad, it's also, it warms your heart when everything comes together. And it's a Christmas carol. It's the essence of Christmas, let's be honest. So that is an absolute must. So I think I might have talked about all of the books I brought out this evening. I'm going to stop here because it's my daughter's birthday tomorrow and I need to go and wrap up her presents. But thanks so much for joining me this evening. Next week, I'm going to be talking about Robinson Crusoe as the first self-help book. So do join me for that. And I'm also going to be talking about it in relation to the Moonstone, and I just need to find my copy of Robinson Crusoe. If anyone out there listening tonight has a copy of Robinson Crusoe and you live somewhere near Brighton, let me know because I can't find my copy. Otherwise, I'll just get one from the library. Anyway, lovely to see you. Do, just before I go, think about the brilliant idea of buying a bibliotherapy session as a gift for a friend or loved one for Christmas. It makes a fantastic gift. Go to my website, elabertu.com, for more details. And in the meantime, stay warm and find someone that you can read aloud with, preferably this evening. Uh, Sorry if you're just joining now, but I am finishing a bit early this evening. But read aloud. That is my message tonight. Read aloud with a friend, a lover, anyone in your family, anyone that you live with. Could be one person, could be several. But give it a go if you've never done it before, even if you think the people that you're suggesting it to might think you're a bit peculiar. Try it, and I bet you'll love it, and they will love it too. So report back. Tell me if you read aloud, what happens, how does it go down, and what did you read aloud? Did did you find anything different to the books I've talked about this evening? Short stories are the way to go to start with. Thanks so much. See you next week. Good night.